The workbench keeps getting full of projects and they just keep on showing up. In this video, we're going to take a look at this Dell Optiplex, what is it, 3010? That a friend of mine gave me basically for 25 bucks. Had some upgrades done to it already. We're going to see what's in there and we're going to see what we can salvage. We're going to see what we can make out of it. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Family Geekery, and today we're going to be taking a look at this old junky Dell Optiplex 3010. And like I said, my friend had this for his girlfriend, put some upgrades in it to make it a little bit faster so she could do some gaming. She eventually upgraded to something better. He said, give me 25 bucks for it, so I gave him 25 bucks for it. So we're going to open this thing up, see what's in there, boot it up, see what's running on it, and see if there's any parts in there that we can take out and maybe build into a really cheap gaming PC. So let's start off by taking the side door off here and just peeking inside before we boot it up. Love these little fancy trap doors that Dell puts on here. So yep, looks like a Dell business computer inside here, except for this thing, whatever this is. Not bolted in, but it's definitely plugged in and it's got power to it. So the GPU in there looks pretty beefy. It's a GTX 970. So not a bad card for something like this. I just wish it had a bracket on it so we could reuse it, but it'll at least boot up like that, I'm sure. So it's being held up by the power cords. So underneath here is some Intel chip of some sort. On the front cover it said i5, so I'm not sure if that's right. Got one stick of RAM in here we can see, and that's definitely not stock RAM. That's like fancy blue gamer RAM, so who knows what that is yet. And let's see, still got the original power supply. That's probably going to be an issue. We probably won't want to keep that. We got a DVD drive in here and a spinning disc, and then looks like we got a little 2.5-inch SATA SSD in here. So let's go ahead and boot this thing up before I take anything apart and see if it fires up, see if it runs, and see what's inside there. Alright, I got her all hooked up. Let's see if this thing powers up. Yep, and sure enough we got power. We got some LEDs here. I don't know if you can see it. Let me point this down a little bit. Yeah, a little green LED on the card there. I got this hooked up to a capture card, so let's see if Windows comes up. Yep, looks like Windows came up, but looks like someone's still signed into this with their account, so that's not going to work. So let's go ahead and turn it back off and maybe go into the BIOS and see what we can read in the BIOS. Alright, so we got into the BIOS and let's see what we got here. So I'm looking at 8 gigs of memory, DDR3, single channel of course. And here's the processor down here, Intel Xeon E3-1230 V2. So someone must have changed this out at some point. The front panel said an i5, but this is clearly a Xeon E3-1230, which is another Ivy Bridge processor if I remember. And I think that one's pretty similar to the i7-3770. So it's the same generation, very similar, 4 cores, 8 threads, maybe a little bit higher clock speed. So this thing should still be able to push some numbers at least. So I'm pretty happy about that. 8 gigs of RAM. We'll probably see if I got a matching pair of 8s and maybe be able to get this thing up to 16. But yeah, that's pretty good. So let's go ahead and look back at the system and see if we can figure out a plan. So looking at this board here, it may be like a micro ATX. So it looks like we may be able to salvage this I/O shield here. And just briefly looking at the screws, where the screws are showing up in here, looks like it might be a standard screw pattern that we can put into a different case. So getting it out of this case would be ideal because then it will look cooler, it will look nicer. Upgrading the power supply to something that's more than 265 watts. It's amazing that they were running a Xeon processor and a 970 GPU with that 265 watt power supply. So we may be able to take this out and put it in a better looking case. Looking at the connections here from the power supply, looks like we might have lucked out too. We've got a 4-pin CPU connector, then a standard 20-pin, 20 plus 4-pin over here. So the motherboard is good to go. Sometimes they have proprietary, power supply pinouts for, proprietary power supply, but this one looks like it'll be plug and play with a standard power supply. So that'll be an easy upgrade. So let's, I think the next step is disconnect everything, start unscrewing everything, and get the parts out onto the bench, and then we'll start piecing things together on the bench and see what the final plan should be. All right, so here's everything pulled out of the case, and let's go over a couple things here that we've learned. We got the motherboard here. We'll take a look at that in a second. The I/O header did pop out. It was pushed in there pretty hard, so I really should have used gloves. Luckily, I didn't cut anything on the fingers, but it was kind of sharp in there, so be careful if you do take one of these apart. We've got a couple hard drives here. Got the 120 gig SSD, and then look at this guy here. This is an old boy. This thing has been around. Quite impressive that it was still in there. And I like looking at the dates. This was actually built in 2006, so obviously not a part of the system originally. Someone put that in there. I'll be surprised if it's still working, but it probably does. Here's our GPU. This is that GTX 970, which unfortunately doesn't have a bracket. It seemed to run just fine, had good video output, but I wouldn't trust putting this in anything without a bracket, so if I can't find a bracket for this, then we'll find a different GPU. Not a super big loss. We've got the DVD drive in there, which oddly enough has a much newer date than the hard drive did. So this is a 2012 date on this guy, so I'll put that in the stack of ever-growing DVD drives that I have in my closet. Here's the power supply. Pulled it out just in case, just to make the case lighter to throw away. And then, so as far as the motherboard goes, I do believe it's going to be a good screw pattern to go into a regular ATX case or micro ATX case. And I think this will be just fine, but we do have a couple issues on here. The power supply sockets were fine, but there was a lot of proprietary stuff plugged in, like your front panel thing here. Now luckily the audio and the USB end up going to some standard audio and USB headers, but there is some like diagnostic stuff on here that goes to this header here, and I think, which plugs in right here, I think if we boot this thing up and it doesn't see this, it's going to be upset. It's probably going to make us press F1 or something. Same thing with the power supply, or the power switch. Not a standard power switch. We've got a power switch that has apparently a couple different colors, maybe yellow and red or something, or yellow and white, to show you a couple different things. So it's got a much different pinout than your standard power supply or power switch. So it's right here, a little 5-pin deal. So my first thought was to just go ahead and get an ohm meter and pin this thing out and just find the right pins for it, either solder this connector onto a regular power switch for the new case, or figure out some way to jumper it. But after a little bit of Googling, I found that they make, or someone makes, it's definitely not Dell, someone makes an adapter kit for these boards that you can plug right into this header and in that header, and then use your standard cabling, and it takes care of all the upset BIOS stuff. So I went ahead and grabbed one of those on Amazon. It's going to be here tomorrow, so we're going to try that out once it gets here. But in the meantime, I think just with all this stuff on the bench, we can still get this thing powered up and booted up and just test it outside the case to make sure everything still works. Alright, so here's what I got put together here. Got the motherboard plugged into just a regular 450 watt power supply, just a Corsair power supply. Just want to make sure that the standard power supply will work with it. I've got the SATA cable here plugged into the SSD drive, which has Windows, and I did reset the Windows on that before I took everything apart. so at least we can get into it now. I've got a just a little temporary GPU. If you've watched my channel before, you know this is my good luck charm here. I always use this because I'm assuming there's no video out on this Xeon processor. I'm finding that these USB ports seem to be dead. Not sure why. I think the board was not well mounted inside there, so something may have shorted out at some point. These are dead, but these are fine here. And then of course we've got the header down here for front USB 2.0. So we'll be fine with that. We'll have enough USB ports that I'm not too concerned about that. But I did plug in just this power cable here, or the power switch, and here just to make it easy. I left the other front panel stuff unplugged just to see what shows up on the screen. So we're going to fire this thing up and see what it does. Alright, so my capture card isn't able to capture this part of the screen, so I'm just going to patch in this other video here, and you can see that it's got a fan failure. So that fan that was plugged into it is a special fan, and it wants to be plugged in, so not sure what I'm going to do with that yet. I could plug it in and just leave it in the case somewhere, but we'll see if there's another fix for that. And then of course we've got this front I/O cable failure, so since I didn't have that plugged in, that's going to show up there. Now, if we did nothing, we could still hit the F1 key and continue, and then we'd get, it would boot up the rest of the way. That's what I'm guessing at least. But that adapter that I picked up on Amazon should take care of that. So let's go ahead and hit F1. And here comes Windows. And just like that, it boots up pretty quick. Alright, so let's just verify real quick in Windows to make sure that it sees everything. And there's the Intel Xeon E3-1230 V2 at 3.3 gigahertz. Here's the 8 gig of RAM, one stick. And there's my SSD drive. So everything looks good in Windows. So now let's come up with a plan with what we want to do with this. Alright, so if the plan is to build a super cheap gaming PC, something that I could just about give away and have some kid play Roblox and Minecraft, that kind of stuff, then we're going to need a different GPU than this. So something cheap but still gameable. I'll take a look to see what I've got for RAM. This is DDR3 RAM, so I've got a bunch of sticks of that left over from different systems. I may have a matching set of 16 gigs. And I'd like to go bigger than 120 gig on the SSD. Either make it 500 gig and just be done with it, or maybe if I can find like a 250 for Windows and then throw just a cheap 1 terabyte drive in there, SATA drive, for loading games and stuff on. So I'll see what I've got around here to see if I've got maybe a 500 gig. That's usually pretty good for a cheap system. That'll hold plenty of games, unless you want to play something like Starfield. But this isn't going to be a Starfield system anyways. So other than that, I think this case, or this power supply, is going to be fine, depending on what GPU I find. And then we just need a case. So I think I've got a little micro ATX case that I can slap this thing into and get all the bits and pieces in there and get this thing put together. So let's go ahead and wait for those adapters to come in. I'll find a case and a GPU, and we'll get this thing put together. Alright, so here we are one day later, and fresh from Amazon, I got my little adapters, which is really cool because usually for something like this you need to go to eBay, and it's going to get shipped from China, and it's usually the cheapest way to go, but these were actually at Amazon for about half the price as the ones on eBay, and they were here in one day, so can't beat that. So we got 3 little adapters here. This one is obviously the front I/O that's going to replace the cable that was plugged in there. It's got some diagnostic lights and basically the HDD light, so the hard drive activity light's going to be on here, and then I think all this stuff's just going to satisfy what the BIOS wants to see for that front I/O cable that we're not going to plug in. This one, based on the missing pin here, I'm guessing it's not labeled at all, but I'm guessing it's for the USB. So I'm going to put this on the USB header here for our front USB 2.0 port, because sometimes these Dells, they want to see their particular USB cable plugged in. So there's something different about them than a standard USB cable. So hopefully this satisfies that. And then here's the one that's got a little 6-pin connector here that's going to go right up here for the power button. And it's going to give us a place for the power switch and then the power LED. And we're not going to worry about this diagnostic LED. So I'm going to plug all these in, and then I'll get some cables to test them, and then we'll see what happens. Alright, so we made some progress here. Let me show you what I got. I've got everything set up so that it can boot all the way into Windows, but there is one last caveat. So I switched out the single RAM to 2 RAMs, 2 chips. The documentation for this particular motherboard says 8 gig max on the system. So I put in 2 4s, which is really all I had anyways. If I find 2 8s, I'll test that out, but I'm good with this for right now. As far as the new adapters that I put in, everything works good. I've got the power and the power LED going to this little breakout box, which is my cute little thing that I use to power up things when I'm bench testing. And I've got this adapter here plugged in. I didn't plug in a light to it, the hard drive LED. I didn't think it was necessary, and it's not, so it doesn't give me an error on there. If you don't have audio and USB plugged into the board, it will give you an error at boot. So I took, just out of an old case, I had one of these sitting around that had leads that go to USB and audio, and that satisfied that. So we're good with that. So the last thing that is a problem is this little dude right here. So without this fan plugged in, it gives you a rear fan error. Press F1 to continue. When you try another standard fan, same thing. So there's something unique about this, and I've read lots of articles about how proprietary the fans are in these things. And there's either some resistance in there or some, voltage difference or something that just makes it non-standard. So once I get it all mounted up in the case, I'll make the determination of if I need to, maybe hide this in there somewhere, or just live with the fact that you have to hit F1 every time you reboot the computer. And that's not the end of the world, but it's just not, ideal. So we're at the point now that I can take everything apart and we can start looking at putting this into a case. Alright, so here's the case I found for it. Just a little deep cool case. And it's got a couple things going for it that's going to make it perfect. First, it already had a 450 watt power supply in there. So I'm going to just go ahead and keep this one in here since it's basically the same as the other one. And then also, the fan that it's got in the back here has both the 3-pin header and a Molex header. So I can go ahead and have this thing powered on so that the fan is working all the time and we don't have to worry about having a fan plugged into the motherboard, which we don't know if those voltages are right. So we're going to use that Molex instead. Now, I'll figure out at some point what to do with that other fan, if I need to hide it or just forget about it altogether. But I think we got everything here that we're going to need to go ahead and get this thing put together. So let me start putting the bits and pieces in. Alright, so we hit our first snag. That's not uncommon. I was right about the screw holes. Everything fits fine. But this board is just long enough that it's going right up against this power supply. So this is the power supply right here. And where that wouldn't usually be a problem, when you have something like this that offsets in that direction, it wants to be further down that way. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and get everything installed and plug everything in. I'm going to bypass this because this is just that USB header, and I don't see anything on here. I can't imagine there's a resistor in the board there, anything, so I'm not sure what's special about this at all. So I'm just going to plug the USB header straight into there and see if I still get an error. If I do, that's kind of bad news and good news, because at that point, if I'm going to have to hit F1 anyways, then I might as well hit F1 for both the fan and the front I/O error. So at that point, it doesn't matter. But we'll go ahead and get this thing screwed down, get everything plugged in, and see what happens. All right, so here she is. I got everything in there. Everything's wired up. And it's not pretty, but I never promised it would be pretty. So I did do a quick test run, and this cable here, being the USB 2.0, plugged into that header just by itself, does bring up a front panel I/O error. So whatever's in this magical little thing, I guess, is required. So the option is find a bigger case that'll fit in with that adapter, or just live with it. And I think I'm going to just live with it, since the fan is going to bring up an error anyways without, fixing something in here to fool it. I'm just going to go ahead and say we got to hit F1 every time you boot it, which, again, this thing boots up in like 10 seconds anyways with the SSD, so I'm not too concerned about that. But other than that, everything's working. I've got the 120 gig hard drive mounted in there for now. I think I might just run with this and put like a 1 terabyte SATA drive in there, and of course clean up some of these cables. And the next thing we need to do is get rid of this donor GPU, and I found this beauty queen here, which is a HP brand. So we got an HP GPU going into a Dell computer, but this is actually a 1060. It's a 1063 gig, but that's going to be plenty of power, and it matches the motif of being ugly. So it's got two things going for it. So it's cheap, it's powerful, it's ugly. That's exactly what we need for this system here. So let me go ahead and swap that out, get some of these cables cleaned up a little bit, and then we'll take a look at Windows. All right, so I got the GPU put in there, and I've got Windows all updated. So let's go ahead and flip over to the screen capture where I've got a benchmark going. And this benchmark here is called Heaven. It's an older benchmark, but it's good for this age of system. And we can see we're running over 100 frames per second. So that's about on par with what I was expecting to get out of this GPU. So it looks like the CPU is handling it just fine. And like I said, this is going to be a cheap system that's going to run, any kind of game like Roblox, Minecraft, maybe even some Fortnite probably. So anything like that. We're just not going to get into the super high resolution, no 4K gaming or anything like that. But this thing's going to run a lot of games just fine. So as I let that benchmark keep on going, I did find a Seagate Barracuda 1 terabyte drive that I can put in there. This thing, it's been sitting around a little bit, but I'm sure it's still got some life in it. So that'll be a cheap little upgrade in there. And then other than that, I think this one's just about ready. So to summarize what we did with this one, we started off with a Dell Optiplex, basically like a business computer that had at some point been upgraded to a Xeon processor. And then we threw 8 gigs of RAM in there. Then we popped in a better GPU, put it in a nicer looking case. Even though this isn't going to be a beauty queen, it's still nicer looking than a Dell. And when you look at it from the front, it's going to look just fine, as long as you don't peek inside the window here and see some of the mess. We've got a SSD in there that's running Windows nice and fast, even if it is small. We'll just make sure that we keep just Windows running on this, and then everything else is going to be loaded onto the hard drive here. And then to make this all work, we did have to buy a couple adapters. They weren't too bad to help us out with getting the power switch and the lights and everything hooked up. Unfortunately, we still have to hit that F1 every time we boot up the computer, but again, that's not a big deal. Boot up the computer, hit F1, you'll be in Windows within a couple seconds, and you're ready to play games. So that's basically going to wrap this one up. I'm pretty happy with what I got here. I like to take and see what I can build out of just about nothing. So in this one, we basically started with a super cheap board that came with a processor and it came with some RAM. We swapped that RAM out, came with a hard drive, and then we added a few parts, and we made ourselves a cheap little gaming computer that someone can enjoy. I get contacted all the time locally here by people who just don't have the money to get their kids a gaming computer, and I like to have some kind of options like this sitting around the shop that I can tell them, hey, we can get your kid playing for pretty darn cheap. So I like helping people out, and I just keep on finding these things, so I keep on building them. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give me that thumbs up. I appreciate that. If you want to see more stuff like this, I've got a bunch of PC builds and a couple different playlists, so go ahead and check those out. And if you like what you see, hit that subscribe button too. But thank you as always for watching, and until next time, peace out and geek out.